In the early morning hours of November 1st, 1951, a 20-year-old Army private named Donald Coe climbed into a trench in the Nevada desert and was told to close his eyes, cover his face with his forearm, and wait. He was stationed at a place called Frenchman Flat, a dry lake bed about 65 miles northwest of Las Vegas that the Atomic Energy Commission had been using as a test site for 2 years. The trench was shallow, maybe 4 feet deep, scraped out of the desert caliche by Army engineers who had assured the men that the depth was adequate, that the position was safe, that the distance between their trench and the tower where the device was mounted, roughly 2 miles, had been calculated by physicists who knew what they were doing. Coe had been in the Army for 8 months. He was from a small town in Ohio. He had never seen a nuclear weapon tested and had only the vaguest understanding of what was about to happen. The officers who briefed him that morning had been specific about 2 things. He was not to look directly at the flash, and he was not to leave the trench until ordered. Everything else, what the radiation would do to his body, what dose he would receive, what the long-term consequences of standing 2 miles from a nuclear detonation might be, had not been discussed because the men giving the briefing did not know, or had been told not to say, or had themselves been assured by people further up the chain that the exposure was within acceptable limits, a phrase that at this point in the history of atomic weapons testing meant almost nothing, because the limits had been set not by epidemiology, but by institutional optimism, by the need to use nuclear weapons tactically, by the conviction that American soldiers had to be trained to fight on an atomic battlefield, and that the only way to train them was to put them on one. The device detonated at 5:30 in the morning. Even with his eyes closed and his face buried in his forearm, Coe later said he could see the bones in his hand through his skin, the way you can see the bones in your hand when you press it against a flashlight in a dark room. The ground shook. The sound arrived several seconds after the light. A pressure wave that hit his chest like a door swung open against him. Then the order came to stand up. And then the order that would define the rest of his life, came to move out, forward, toward the blast, across the desert toward the column of smoke, and the settling debris cloud and the contaminated ground where a nuclear weapon had detonated 11 minutes earlier, to practice what the Army called atomic maneuver, to demonstrate that American infantry could take and hold terrain in a nuclear environment, to prove to the watching officers and the watching cameras and the watching world that the atomic battlefield was survivable, that American soldiers could walk through it and come out the other side. Donald Coe walked through it, so did several hundred other men that morning. None of them were given radiation monitoring equipment that produced a readable result. None of them were told what dose they had received. None of them were warned about the symptoms to watch for in the weeks and months and years ahead. They were marched back out of the contaminated zone, dusted off with brooms by personnel who were themselves wearing minimal protective equipment, loaded onto trucks, and told that what they had participated in was classified. They were told not to discuss it with family members, with doctors, with anyone outside the military chain of command. They were told this not because the military had discovered something alarming about their exposure and wanted to prevent panic, but as a matter of routine procedure, a blanket classification that covered all nuclear test activities, regardless of what they revealed. Donald Coe went home to Ohio in 1953. He got married, got a job, had children. In 1964, he was diagnosed with leukemia. He was 33 years old. He applied to the Veterans Administration for benefits, citing his participation in nuclear tests as a possible cause. The Veterans Administration denied his claim. They told him his exposure had been within safe limits. When he asked to see his dosimetry records, the documents that would have recorded exactly how much radiation he had received at Frenchman Flat in November 1951, he was told the records could not be located. This was the answer that tens of thousands of men who had stood in the Nevada desert and the Marshall Islands and the waters of the Pacific would receive over the next 30 years, delivered in different language by different officials, but always meaning the same thing. We know what we did. We are not going to tell you, and we are not going to pay for it. This is the story of the atomic veterans, the men the United States deliberately placed in the path of nuclear weapons to study what would happen to them, and of the half-century they spent trying to make their country admit what it had done. The program that produced Donald Coe's experience at Frenchman Flat had roots that went back almost to the first use of atomic weapons in combat. After the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, American military planners faced a question that no military in history had ever had to answer. How do you train soldiers to fight on a nuclear battlefield? The weapons that had destroyed 2 Japanese cities in minutes were going to become a permanent feature of modern warfare. That much was clear. What was not clear was how infantry, armor, artillery, the conventional forces that would still be needed after the nuclear exchange, could operate in an environment where atomic weapons had been used. Could soldiers advance across ground that had been hit by a nuclear device? How soon? How close could they get to a detonation and still function? What were the psychological effects of witnessing a nuclear blast at close range? Would men freeze? Would they break? Would they be able to follow orders, maintain unit cohesion, execute tactical movements in the aftermath of something that no training exercise had ever simulated? These were genuine operational questions, and in the late 1940s, as the Soviet Union developed its own atomic capability and American defense planners began thinking seriously about the possibility of nuclear warfare in Europe, they became urgent ones. The solution the military arrived at was characteristically direct. They would find out by testing. Not testing on lab animals, not testing on simulated populations, but testing on the actual soldiers who would be expected to fight on the atomic battlefield, because only by exposing real men to real detonations could you get data that was operationally meaningful. This logic was accepted at the highest levels of the military establishment, with remarkably little debate about its ethical implications. The men who made these decisions were not sadists. They were military planners operating under the assumptions of their time and their institution, and the central assumption was that soldiers were a resource to be deployed in the service of national security, and that some expenditure of that resource, some acceptable level of risk, was the price of maintaining American military superiority in the atomic age. What they did not reckon with, because the science of radiation biology was still in its early stages, and because the institutional incentive was to minimize rather than confront the risks, was the specific nature of the damage they were inflicting. They did not understand, or did not want to understand, that the radiation their soldiers were absorbing at Nevada test sites and Pacific proving grounds was not a temporary insult that the body would recover from, but a form of biological damage that would accumulate silently over years and decades before, expressing itself as cancer, as leukemia, as thyroid disease, as chromosomal damage passed to the next generation. They did not understand this, or they understood it and decided the operational necessity outweighed it, or some combination of both. The historical record does not allow for a clean verdict on which of these was true, because the people making the decisions were simultaneously the people controlling the information about the consequences, and they controlled that information very carefully for a very long time. The Nevada test site, established in 1951 on a parcel of desert in Nye County that the federal government had requisitioned during the war, became the primary location for what the military called troop maneuver exercises, operations in which soldiers were positioned at varying distances from nuclear detonations and then ordered to advance toward, or through, the blast area after the device had fired. These exercises had names that sound almost cheerful in retrospect, the kind of names military planners assign to operations to make them sound routine and purposeful. Desert Rock 1, Desert Rock 2, Desert Rock 3, continuing through 8 iterations over 4 years. The Desert Rock exercises were the Army's primary vehicle for troop training in atomic warfare, and they sent tens of thousands of soldiers through the Nevada desert during the early 1950s. The distances at which soldiers were positioned varied by exercise and by the yield of the device being tested. In some exercises, troops were stationed 7 miles from the detonation point. In others, they were as close as 2 miles. In a small number of exercises, soldiers were positioned in trenches less than 2 miles from a device with a yield of more than 10 kilotons, comparable to the bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima, and were ordered to leave those trenches and advance toward ground zero within minutes of the detonation, moving through the fallout zone on foot and in vehicles. The stated purpose was to acclimatize soldiers to the atomic battlefield, to reduce the psychological shock of witnessing a nuclear detonation, and to demonstrate that conventional tactical operations could continue in the aftermath. The unstated purpose, documented in internal military and atomic energy commission memos that were declassified decades later, was also to gather data on the physical effects of radiation exposure on healthy human subjects. Data that could not be obtained any other way because no laboratory environment could replicate the conditions of an actual nuclear detonation. The soldiers who participated in these exercises were not told they were research subjects. They were told they were being trained. The distinction mattered enormously because it meant they had not consented to what was being done to them, could not have consented because they had not been given the information that would have allowed them to make an informed choice. And in any case, we're operating within a military structure in which the concept of refusing an order from a superior officer was not a realistic option. You did what you were told. You went where you were sent. If you were sent into a radioactive dust cloud 2 miles from a nuclear detonation, you went into the radioactive dust cloud. The dosimetry, the measurement of radiation doses received by individual soldiers, was, from the beginning of the program, inadequate in ways that were either the product of genuine technological limitation or deliberate design, and the historical record suggests it was some of both. Film badges, the primary dosimetry tool used during the Desert Rock exercises, were small devices worn on the body that measured cumulative gamma radiation exposure. They had significant limitations. They did not measure neutron dose. They did not measure internal contamination from inhaled or ingested radioactive particles, and they required careful laboratory processing to produce accurate readings. The badges issued to soldiers during Desert Rock exercises were often not processed at all, or were processed in batches that produced average readings rather than individual ones, or were collected after exercises and simply never analyzed. In some cases, soldiers were not issued badges at all. In other cases, badges were issued, but collected before the soldiers entered the most contaminated areas, which meant the recorded dose reflected only the exposure from the initial blast and not the far more significant exposure from moving through the fallout zone on foot. when researchers from the Defense Nuclear Agency attempted to reconstruct the doses received by individual soldiers during the Desert Rock exercises in the 1980s, after congressional pressure had finally forced a review. They found that records were missing for a substantial fraction of participants, that the records that did exist were often internally inconsistent, and that in a number of cases the recorded doses appeared to have been revised downward from initial measurements in ways that could not be explained by measurement error. The word falsified appears in some researchers' accounts of what they found. The official position was that the discrepancies were the result of poor record keeping during a period when dosimetry science was still developing. The men who had been in those trenches had a different interpretation, and they had been living with the consequences for long enough that their interpretation deserved to be taken seriously. The Nevada exercises were only part of the picture. The other part was the Pacific, and the Pacific was in some ways more extreme, both in the scale of the weapons being tested and in the proximity of some of the men who witnessed them. Operation Crossroads in 1946, the first post-war nuclear test series, detonated 2 devices at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands in the presence of a fleet of target ships crewed by goats and rats and observed by an audience of American military personnel, foreign observers, and journalists positioned on vessels nearby. The second device, detonated underwater, produced a column of radioactive water that contaminated the entire target fleet and spread a film of radioactive material across a wide area of ocean. The sailors tasked with boarding the contaminated ships to assess damage were given minimal protective equipment and no meaningful dosimetry. Some of them scrubbed radioactive contamination off the decks of target ships with mops and buckets and their bare hands. The levels of contamination on those ships were, in several cases, high enough that the Navy's own radiation safety officers recommended against boarding them. The recommendations were noted, and the boarding operations proceeded anyway, because there was information that needed to be gathered, and there were men available to gather it. And the institutional calculation was that the information was worth the risk to the men. Operation Castle in 1954 produced what may be the single most consequential radiological accident in the history of nuclear testing, and it happened because the weapon worked better than anyone had predicted. Castle Bravo, detonated at Bikini Atoll on March 1, 1954, was designed to produce a yield of approximately 6 megatons. It produced 15. The fallout from the unanticipated yield spread across an area hundreds of miles larger than the safety calculations had assumed, contaminating inhabited atolls whose populations had been told the test area was safe, and exposing the crew of a Japanese fishing vessel called the Lucky Dragon No. 5 to levels of radiation that killed 1 crew member and sickened the rest. It also exposed American military personnel stationed on islands within the fallout zone to doses that exceeded the program's own safety limits, doses that in some cases were not recorded or were recorded inaccurately, doses that the men receiving them were told were not dangerous, and which the Atomic Energy Commission, in its public statements about Castle Bravo, described as presenting no serious hazard to the health of any affected personnel. The crew of the Lucky Dragon knew differently. The populations of Rongelap and Utrecht atolls, evacuated days after the detonation, after receiving substantial radiation doses, knew differently. The American servicemen who had been on those islands would spend years trying to get the Veterans Administration to acknowledge that they knew differently too. The specific mechanics of how soldiers were used in these tests, the operational details that distinguish this program from an accident or an oversight and place it clearly in the category of deliberate institutional decision-making, are laid out in documents that were declassified piecemeal over several decades, beginning in the mid-1970s and continuing into the 1990s, some of them still partially redacted today. What the documents show is a program that was not merely careless with the health of its participants, but was, in important respects, designed around the collection of data on human subjects in a way that required those subjects not to know they were being studied. Internal Atomic Energy Commission documents from the early 1950s discuss the value of nuclear tests as opportunities to gather data on human physiological response to radiation exposure. A 1953 memo from the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, the joint military body responsible for nuclear weapons development and testing, explicitly describes certain troop exercises as providing data on the psychological and physiological effects of atomic weapons on military personnel that cannot be obtained by other means. A 1956 report from the Army's Chemical Corps, obtained through Freedom of Information Act, requests by journalists in the 1980s, contains a section on human factor studies in atomic exercises that discusses the use of participant soldiers as, in the document's own language, a source of exposure data supplementing animal studies. None of the soldiers described in these documents as sources of exposure data were told that was what they were. None of them signed consent forms. None of them were given the option to decline. They were soldiers. They went where they were told. They stood in the places they were told to stand. They walked in the directions they were told to walk. And then they went home and got sick and spent the rest of their lives trying to prove that the sickness had something to do with what they had been told to do. The Veterans Administration's response to the atomic veterans, the men who came home from Nevada and the Pacific, carrying doses of radiation in their bodies that their records either could not or would not account for, is one of the more sustained institutional failures in the history of American government. The VA's position, maintained with remarkable consistency from the early 1950s through the late 1970s, was that the radiation exposures received during nuclear tests had been within safe limits, that the men's cancers and leukemias and thyroid diseases were not service-connected, and that therefore the VA had no obligation to provide compensation or treatment. This position was maintained despite the fact that the VA often could not produce the dosimetry records that would have established what the safe limits were and whether they had been exceeded, because the records had not been kept, or had been lost, or had been destroyed, or had been classified at a level the VA's own reviewers could not access. It was maintained despite the fact that the epidemiological data, when researchers were finally able to gather it in the 1970s and 1980s, showed elevated rates of multiple myeloma, leukemia, thyroid cancer, and other radiation-associated malignancies among atomic veterans compared to the general military population. It was maintained in some cases even after the federal government's own scientific advisory bodies had concluded that radiation exposure at the doses received during some of the test exercises was causally associated with precisely the cancers the veterans were presenting with. The VA denied claims. It lost files. It required veterans to produce records that it knew did not exist. It applied burden of proof standards that were, in practice, impossible for veterans to meet, because meeting them would have required documentation that the government had either never created or had deliberately destroyed. The men who went through this process, most of them by this point in their 50s and 60s, sick, often dying, navigating a bureaucratic system that seemed designed to exhaust rather than assist them, described it in the testimony they gave to Congress and in the interviews they gave to journalists in terms that ranged from bewildered to furious. One veteran, a man named Orville Kelly from Iowa, who had participated in Operation Hardtack in the Pacific in 1958 and was dying of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in the mid-1970s, founded an organization called the National Association of Atomic Veterans in 1974 because he had discovered, through correspondence with other sick men, that his experience was not unique and that there was strength in numbers, that there was not an individual complaint. Kelly died in 1980. His organization continued after him, pressing Congress, pressing the VA, pressing the Defense Nuclear Agency to produce the records that would establish what had been done to its members and what the consequences had been. The scientific case for the link between the veterans' exposures and their cancers was built slowly, against institutional resistance, by a combination of independent researchers, congressional investigators, and the veterans themselves, who contributed their own medical records and their own testimony to a body of evidence that the government spent years dismissing and decades minimizing. The key scientific work was done in several stages. The first was the reconstruction studies, attempts by researchers at the Defense Nuclear Agency and later at the National Cancer Institute to piece together, from the fragmentary records that existed, the actual doses received by soldiers during specific test exercises. These studies, begun in the late 1970s under congressional pressure, produced dose estimates that were, in many cases, significantly higher than the official figures that had been used to deny veterans' claims. They also revealed, in their own internal documentation, the extent to which original dose records had been inadequate, inconsistent, or simply absent. The second stage was the epidemiological work, the comparison of cancer rates among atomic veterans with cancer rates among comparable military populations who had not been exposed. This work was complicated by the fact that the government did not have a reliable roster of who had participated in nuclear tests because the record-keeping during the test program had been as haphazard as the dosimetry. The best estimate, derived from military records and test program documents, was that approximately 400,000 American military personnel had participated in atmospheric nuclear tests during the period from 1945 to 1962. Studies conducted by the Centers for Disease Control, the National Academy of Sciences, and independent academic researchers during the 1980s found elevated rates of leukemia, multiple myeloma, and several solid tumors among subsets of this population, with the elevation most pronounced among men who had been closest to the detonations and who had entered the post-shot areas on foot. The government contested these findings at every stage, commissioning its own studies, disputing the methodologies of independent researchers, arguing that the elevated rates were within the range of statistical variation and could not be definitively attributed to radiation exposure. This argument that definitive attribution was impossible and that therefore no compensation was owed was the core of the VA's position for 30 years, and it was not wrong on its own terms. Definitive attribution of a specific cancer to a specific radiation exposure in a specific individual is, in most cases, scientifically impossible. Radiation causes cancer by damaging DNA, but the DNA damage caused by radiation is indistinguishable from the DNA damage caused by other carcinogens, and cancer is common enough in the general population that any given veteran's cancer could, in principle, have developed without any contribution from his nuclear test exposure. The VA used this scientific uncertainty as a policy lever, treating the impossibility of definitive individual attribution as justification for denying all claims across the board. an approach that required them to ignore the population-level evidence of elevated risk, evidence that was not ambiguous and that the VA's own scientific reviewers, in internal documents that became public through congressional investigation, acknowledged was compelling. The men who spent their lives fighting for recognition fall into a category of American veteran that the public has never fully been able to see clearly, partly because their injuries were invisible in the way that radiation injuries are invisible. No missing limbs, no visible scars, nothing that reads immediately as the consequence of military service. And partly because the government spent so long and worked so hard to ensure that the connection between their service and their suffering remained officially unestablished. Orville Kelly was one. Another was Paul Cooper, a Navy veteran who had been aboard a ship during Operation Hardtack and who developed thyroid cancer in his 50s and spent 12 years fighting the VA before receiving any benefits, submitting hundreds of pages of documentation, appearing before congressional committees, writing letters that he knew might never be read by anyone with the authority to change anything. Another was James Poole, an Army veteran of the Desert Rock exercises who testified before the House Veterans Affairs Committee in 1979 that he had watched 3 of his comrades from his test unit die of leukemia within 10 years of their return from Nevada, that he himself had been diagnosed with a blood disorder his doctors associated with radiation exposure, and that in 20 years of dealing with the VA, he had never once been told that his exposure at Frenchman Flat had been recorded, or that the record was available for him to review. He said this not with anger, exactly, but with a kind of exhausted specificity that was more devastating than anger would have been. He knew the details. He had done the research. He had found the other men. He had compared their medical histories and their test assignments and their dosimetry records, the ones that existed. And he had put together a picture that the VA had refused to look at for 2 decades, and he sat in front of a congressional committee and laid it out piece by piece, name by name, and asked them to explain how this had happened in a country that said it honored its veterans. The committee had no good answer. Congress, in fact, had been receiving testimony like Poole's for years by 1979 and had done relatively little with it, partly because the VA was a powerful institutional constituency, and partly because acknowledging the full scope of what had been done to atomic veterans would have opened a financial liability that the government was not eager to quantify. The legislative reckoning, when it finally came, was partial and slow, and arrived too late. For many of the men, it was designed to help. The Radiation-Exposed Veterans Compensation Act of 1988, passed 35 years after the Desert Rock exercises began, created a presumptive service connection for a list of specific cancers in veterans who had participated in nuclear tests, meaning that a veteran who had certain cancers and could document his presence at a test exercise no longer had to prove a causal link between his exposure and his disease. The presumption did the work that the science could not do definitively for any individual case. The list of covered cancers was drawn from the epidemiological evidence of which malignancies were most strongly associated with radiation exposure, and was revised and expanded in subsequent legislation as the evidence base grew. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act of 1990 extended a similar framework to uranium miners, downwinders, civilians who had lived near test sites and been exposed to fallout, and on-site test participants, creating a compensation fund that has paid out several $billion over the decades since its passage. These were genuine legislative achievements, produced by years of advocacy by the veterans themselves and by the researchers and journalists and congressional staffers who believed the evidence and were willing to press for action against institutional resistance. They were also, by the time they arrived, too late for a substantial fraction of the men they covered. Orville Kelly was dead. Thousands of others had died fighting claims that would have been automatically approved under the 1988 legislation. The benefits that were eventually acknowledged as owed were acknowledged after the men who had earned them were no longer alive to receive them. What remains beyond the legislation and the compensation payments and the declassified documents is the harder question of what it means that this happened at all, that a democratic government, without the knowledge or consent of the men involved, placed several 100,000 of its own soldiers in the path of nuclear weapons, collected data on the effects, destroyed or failed to maintain the records that would have established the doses received, and then spent 3 decades denying that the consequences had anything to do with the exposure. The men who ran the test program were not acting outside the norms of their time in every respect. Radiation safety was genuinely less understood in 1951 than it is today, and some of the harm done was the product of ignorance rather than calculation. But ignorance does not explain the missing dosimetry records. It does not explain the internal memos that described soldiers as sources of exposure data. It does not explain the VA's decades-long resistance to claims that the government's own scientific advisors were acknowledging had merit. Those things require a different explanation, one that has to do with institutional self-protection, with the enormous financial liability that full acknowledgement would have created, with the bureaucratic tendency to defend a position once it has been taken regardless of what the evidence says, and with the specific power dynamic of the relationship between a soldier and the government that trained him, sent him into the desert, and then told him for the rest of his life that what happened to him there had nothing to do with what was done to him. The atomic veterans were not a special case in American military history. They were a particularly well-documented example of something that recurs throughout that history. The willingness of the institution to treat the men it uses as expendable when acknowledging what was done to them becomes politically or financially inconvenient. The records that exist, the declassified memos, the congressional testimony, the epidemiological studies, the veterans' own accounts, are sufficient to establish what happened with a high degree of confidence. What they cannot restore is the 30 years those men spent being told they were wrong about their own bodies, wrong about their own service, wrong about the connection between what their country asked of them and what their country then refused to acknowledge it owed.